pious Christians sometimes make me very angry. They don't even know Christianity. They don't know the man they're following. He was a revolutionary. He was a dangerous man. And by God, so am I. And so should you be. This country was founded by dangerous men. Amen. The moment the people in this country cease to be dangerous men, it's going to be the day we cease to have a country.
Welcome back to BCFM's Politics Show with old Labour Oxford economist Martin Summers and me, Tony Gosling. Brussels under attack, but yet again the story presented by the Belgian authorities and known ISIS propaganda websites is full of holes. Before we try and find out who really did it, we go through the dozens or so holes in the official Brussels bombing story. The mainstream media don't dare to ask. And explain why what we're being told doesn't add up. Martin, what's your first thoughts about last week's attack in Brussels?
Well, the first thing, of course, is to put it in context. We know from studies of history that NATO intelligence services who are based in Brussels have a track record of basically faking terrorist attacks. I mean, carrying terrorist attacks out but blaming others for what they have themselves done. So you could compare, for example, the Brabant Massacres in the 1980s, where supermarkets in Belgium were attacked by attackers wearing Halloween masks who shot people at random, and police investigations in Belgium is subsequently established beyond any reasonable doubt that this was actually being carried out by NATO intelligence services as part of a strategy of tension. And Belgium has actually suffered quite a lot from this kind of thing over the years. So the first thing to do is to put it in a context. We know that this kind of thing has happened in the past. Is it what's happening today?
Also, of course, as part of those Operation Gladio attacks, there was the rather nasty bombing at the Octoberfest in 1980 in Germany. In fact, that was Germany's last major terrorist incident, was actually carried out by, it seems now, by NATO. In fact, the German documentary programme that came out last year re-looked at that and said that there was actually a massive police cover-up, and it looked as if that the secret state in Germany was one of the main instigators behind the Octoberfest bomb, which killed something like 20 people, I believe, in 1980.
Yes, well, I mean, after the Paris attacks, Erdogan, who's the president of Turkey, turned up to the sort of, solidarity fest afterwards. But he raised questions about whether the Israeli intelligence services had been involved in the attacks in Paris. Now, that's not the sort of thing you hear on Radio 4, but it was in fact what he said, and he might even have been right about that. But of course the other things that are quite interesting is that these attackers, who have been, if they are the attackers, who carried out this Brussels attack, had been inside Syria cooperating with MIT, which is the Turkish intelligence services, in order to try and overthrow Assad. And the YPG, which is the Kurdish militias inside northern Syria, have captured a Turkish intelligence officer inside Syria, and they've interrogated him, and what he's been saying is that yes, indeed, they were working for MIT, these terrorists, and that they were being infiltrated into Brussels, into Belgium, to attack these targets. But of course, that will be NATO operations. Don't forget, MIT is an integral part of NATO's intelligence structure, which is headed up by CIA MI6.
Interesting, isn't it, that Erdogan on the Friday before the Brussels attack actually did say that there could be an attack in Brussels.
Well, indeed, and he then said we sent these terrorists towards you, and we even warned you that they were terrorists, and you did nothing. Well, that's a bit of a giveaway, isn't it? We sent these people on to you and warned you they were terrorists, but you did nothing. What are you doing sending terrorists to Belgium? And of course they were inside Syria. They were then supposedly picked up by the Turkish police and then deported. And both of them had track records as bank robbers and petty thieves. Are these the kind of people who would kill themselves for ideology? Well, that's another question.
Well, that's interesting you talk about suicide bombers there, because the source of that news is the Amaq news agency, AMAQ news agency. They were the people who immediately said that there were several ISIS fighters that detonated explosive belts at the airport and the train station. The investigators then, we were told, reportedly also found pretty much immediately chemical products and an Islamic State flag. But this Amaq news agency, Martin, these are the people that release information to the mainstream press about ISIS, and they also release that information through something called SITE, which is run by Rita Katz in the United States. We've been talking about them before.
Yeah, well, SITE is supposedly, the SITE stands for Searching the Internet for Terrorist Entities, and it is an organisation based in Langley, Virginia, just down the road from the CIA. And for some reason, it's headed up by Rita Katz, who's a former Israeli intelligence agent, and they seem to get all of ISIS's videos first. ISIS seem to use them as their favoured place to put out their extreme videos. If people can't start to smell what's wrong with all of this by now, they need to start.
But then we quickly heard that apparently they weren't suicide bombers, or at least one of them wasn't. They were actually just pushing their bombs on airport trolleys. Let's just make it clear to start with that the bomb took place just before the check-in, so it wasn't in the departure lounge of the airport where the gates are. It was really not even properly subject to security. But this is the first part of the story that changed immediately. We were told, first of all, they had suicide belts on. Then we were told, no, actually, they were pushing their bombs on their trolley, and they just decided that they were going to die when that bomb exploded. Now, this is a new kind of suicide bomber that we're coming across.
Well, more likely is that they were patsies, and the bombs were, they don't even know they're carrying the bombs necessarily. These questions all have to be raised. And, of course, the security at Brussels Airport is run by ICTS, which is an Israeli-linked security company who happen to be in charge of Schiphol Airport.
Hang on, because just to be fair, you can't blame ICTS. Anybody can walk into an airport at the to the check-in areas.
I think it's an extraordinary coincidence that the airports where these incidents happen all happen to have ICT. Most people don't realise that the privatisation of security at international airports...
security wasn't even involved in this case. Anybody can go into a car park and go up to a check-in desk. There is no security.
No, but I still think it's of some significance, because ICTS were in charge of security at Schiphol when the so-called underpants bomber got on the plane, and according to eyewitnesses, a senior solicitor who was on a lawyer who was on the plane, Kurt Haskell, he was taken through without a passport, with only a one-way ticket, and with no shoes on, and all the rest of it. He was taken straight through without even being checked. We've got to get people to understand, in Turkey itself, for example, the so-called ISIS attacks on the Kurdish rally, the two Kurdish rallies, and the other attack that may or may not be ISIS that took place in Ankara not long ago. Everybody in Turkey knows that their own intelligence services are often implicated in these attacks. That's what restarted the war between the PKK and the Turkish government, as they immediately presumed, and rightly, in my view, that the ISIS attack on their rally, which killed 30 of their young militants, was in fact carried out by MIT agents, by the Turkish army.
Yes, and of course they've closed the Zaman newspaper down, which was very critical.
The Zaman newspaper was reporting that two things. It reported that the Turkish involvement in the chemical weapons attack at Ghouta, and they also reported that the Turkish police had stopped a convoy of weaponry going into Turkey, into Syria, and the people who were driving the trucks were all MIT operatives.
Well, you mentioned the Turkish intelligence agents. You mentioned the attack in Ankara on Saturday the 12th of March. That killed 37 people, but I think it's in context. Let's look, because we've had a lot of attacks, haven't we, over the last few weeks. Then on Sunday the 13th of March in Ivory Coast, there were 16 people killed by gunmen at some kind of resort there. Tuesday the 15th of March, Mastaba Market in Yemen, 120 people were killed, actually civilians at a market, by a Saudi airstrike. 120 killed in Yemen. Tuesday the 22nd of March was the Brussels attacks, where we now know 31, although CNN and others still seem to be saying 35. I don't know quite why. But then on Good Friday there was an attack in Baghdad, Iraq. 41 people were killed, but there were attacks pretty much weekly in Iraq. Actually 2 or 3 bomb attacks in Turkey every week. And then on Sunday the 27th in Lahore, Pakistan, 65 people were killed. So this does seem to be, it's almost like another day, another suicide bomber, or another bomb attack. And there's very little time to actually analyse, which is why it's interesting and I think important to take a step back from this and do a bit of analysis and contextualise what happened in Brussels. And of course, Brussels being the headquarters of NATO and the European Union.
Indeed. So you've got to ask yourself, well, who benefits from these attacks?
Is it fair to say it's the EU's 9/11?
I think we're... 9/11 has got many holes in the official story as well. What we're seeing, the pattern is becoming clearer, because in Turkey it's absolutely clear that MIT, the Turkish intelligence services, are an integral part of NATO. They work with MI6, they work with SAS, they work with CIA.
So the reason you're joining Turkey with this is you're saying, although we're not in a political alliance with Turkey, we're very much in a military alliance.
Well, indeed, when we are in a political alliance with them as well. I mean, the PKK is still basically regarded as a terrorist organisation by the British government, even though many would argue that they are freedom fighters, just like in Syria or in Libya.
And one of the most important bits of information to come out, at least in my view, is the presence of at least one soldier. Well, you don't really get generally one soldier on their own in the airport at the time of the bomb attacks. Actually, behind the scenes, it seems to be being described here by airport worker Tom Donker. And here's an extract from BBC 5 Live on the day with his testimony of what he saw. He's an airport worker, Tom Donker.
So he ran away from the airport as fast as he can, and everybody else that was in the terminal followed immediately after.
Tom Donker is an airport worker. He told the BBC he'd actually just started his shift when the first explosion came.
We were going to our desks to the gate, and we looked to our left side, and it looked like 50 meters of us was a big explosion. First we thought it was a billboard falling down or something. And my colleague was looking and was wondering what is it. And I said, run. We ran away. We were running very quickly. My colleague jumped into the carousel behind the check-in desk. I lost him because I didn't know where he was. I ran straight on, and it was like 20 centimeters of me. It was a big explosion. The second one, big explosion. I thought I was hurt. I was hit. And then there were two people who were working at on the airport. They told me to come inside. They locked the door, and behind a little gap, I saw a soldier putting away a body. I hope he was not dead, and he was just hit.
Tom Donker, an airport worker. The travel editor of The Independent, Simon Calder, says...
Well, that's Tom Donker there, Martin. Quite interesting to hear that there's at least one soldier there on the scene ready to deal with dead and injured.
Indeed, and of course we're still getting more information as time goes on. As you pointed out...
Well, actually, I do argue we get less. So it seems to, kind of close down, and it's at these initial moments, like literally on the day, that you'll hear that actually there was a soldier there. That's not normal for a soldier to be at the scene of a bomb attack like that. Did they have a warning? It's got to be... or was there an exercise or something going on?
As Haaretz pointed out, the Israeli newspaper, that Belgian intelligence had precise warning that the airport was targeted for the bombing. Also, of course, on the day, the Belgian media immediately issued what they claimed to be CCTV footage of the bombings, which was then exposed by The Independent as being CCTV footage from a bombing in Moscow and a bombing in Minsk, which had taken place some time previously. Now, they'd obviously changed the time signatures and the date stamps and everything on these videos, so it wasn't an accident, and it was kind of presented in The Independent as the social media were already circulating these incorrect videos. It wasn't social media which was the source of it. It was Belgian mainstream media, who presumably, had been tipped off to do their bit of creating the right impression around the attack. Just like the attack in Bologna in 1980, which killed 86 people. People forget about these things, but that was shown by police investigation in Italy to be SISMI, i.e. NATO intelligence services.
Okay.
So it may or may not be NATO intelligence services, but the balance of probability is that they are behind this.
Okay, the police also questioned the Brussels bombers just a week before the airport and subway attacks. We hear Khalid and Brahim El-Bakouri were again arrested just a few days before the 22nd of March 2016 attack, according to the Centre for Security Policy. So it seems like many of these terrorist attacks, you've got people who are actually right at the top of the terror watch list who then manage to get themselves bombs and blow them up.
Well, like the Kouachi brothers who supposedly carried out the Paris attacks, who had been on the watch list for ages, carried out the attacks and then conveniently left their passports to implicate themselves so that they could then be rounded up and shot and blamed hanged for what had happened. There's going to be some interesting fallout from this, because some of the so-called terrorists have survived and will have to be put on trial, and it may be that we'll find something out from that. But if we look at what happened with the Boston bombing trials of the Dudayev, the Tsarnaev brothers and so on, trials can be fixed as well. And we've got a track record of NATO intelligence services, particularly the Turks, but not only the Turks. In the Ergenecon networks in Turkey were exposed, and senior generals were sent to prison. It was absolutely clear what they were doing. They were bombing, shooting, killing, pretending to be Islamists, but in actual fact it was the Turkish military. And I would suggest that the hands of the Turkish military, fingerprints of the Turkish military, are quite likely to be found on this attack if you look closely enough.
In October 2014, a Jihadi training camp was discovered in Belgium, just a couple of hours by car from Brussels, almost like under the noses of NATO. Jihadis training in the woods, in the Ardennes forest.
Yes, well, that sounds very similar to the Gladio training camps that used to exist back in the 70s and the 80s, where right-wing militants were being trained to bomb, shoot, kill, attack people in supermarkets. And, of course, it was all... What you ask, well, why do they do this? In the 1980s, what it was about, you had a socialist government in Belgium which did not want US cruise missiles, and were going to vote to have US cruise missiles not to be sighted on Belgian soil. But very embarrassing, because the headquarters of NATO is at shape in Brussels. So suddenly all of these mad attacks start happening, and then the politicians get the message. You stay in line, or we're going to make trouble for you.
We're also told, aren't we, of course, that this is an ISIS attack, but Michael Flynne from the Defence Intelligence Agency has said that the creation of ISIS was a willful decision of the White House.
Well, Michael Flynn's a very interesting character, because he was actually in charge of US military in the Middle East, and he's been pushed out now, and one of the things he's done is he's leaked the NSA report, which said that we know what ISIS is about. They're going to take over a large chunk of Syria. In actual fact, we're quite positive about that, because that will help to overthrow Assad. So this was a confidential report that he leaked. And the other thing about Flynn is that he then, having resigned from the US military, went to, according to Seymour Hersh in the London Review of Books, he was a very senior journalist in the US, the US Army were passing intelligence to the Syrian army and to the Russians to help them in Syria, to eliminate CIA-supported groups which they were unhappy with. And then Flynn, in fact, appeared in Moscow at the Russia Today's anniversary dinner, meeting with Vladimir Putin, and he's now advising Donald Trump on his foreign policy. So I suggest that there are splits developing between the military in the US and the CIA and the other spooks who are basically manipulators.
The mad thing here is that even if it is ISIS, it looks as if the Western intelligence services, NATO intelligence, people like that, are all over ISIS. They know exactly where they are all the time.
Well, this is why Zaman was closed down in Turkey, because they exposed the intimate linkage between the Turkish government and military and ISIS. ISIS is, as far as many people in Syria are concerned, as far as the Iranians are concerned, as far as the Russian general staff are concerned, essentially a NATO-Saudi front, with the Turks very hands-on, and don't forget that the Turks now are in a bit of a dilemma, because what's happened in Syria means that they can't really overthrow Assad, but that puts Erdogan in a very difficult position, puts the Saudis in a very difficult position. So it's in their interests to have terrorist attacks in Western Europe, because they hope that it may provoke a further intervention in Syria to remove Assad. That's where we've got to, and I think that all of these things are likely.
Also, on Sunday, we saw, I think, one of the most strong indications that something funny's going on in Brussels was that the police allowed a fascist march to march right into March, which they said that the peace campaigners shouldn't march, and so there was a vigil there instead. But then the Belgian police didn't. I mean, this is... it's got to be deliberate. They didn't stop the fascist marching. The fascists got together a few blocks away and then just marched without any challenge from the police right into the middle of the peace vigil.
Well, I mean, we've got to work out who's on what side here. Well, one would hope that the police force will be independent of the intelligence services, but you can't rely on that. In Italy, Imposimato is head of the Italian Supreme Court.
Isn't that what the police are for, to stop that sort of thing happening? Also, of course, we know the police do infiltrate both fascist groups and other groups.
Well, indeed.
They know what they're doing.
Yeah, but the problem is how independent are the police force?
It would have been simple for the police to stop that happening.
Yes, and it may be that they're implicated in this stuff. You can't presume that the police are not being manipulated by the intelligence services. It would be nice to think that they weren't, but you can't presume that they're not. I think that these terrorist attacks are part of a strategy to create a police state. That's what they're about. the evidence piled up over many years. And it's got very, very poignant now with what's going on in Turkey and Syria. It's been clearly exposed by the media in Turkey, the linkages between the government and the military and ISIS and Al-Qaeda, Syria, Al-Nusra Front and so on. All of these things are coming, it's futile to deny them. Everybody knows that that's what's been going on. Now, if that's what's been going on, it could be ISIS attacking Brussels airport on their own. But even, as you rightly point out, ISIS is a front organisation for MIT, the Turkish intelligence services, the CIA and the Saudi Mukhabarat. And, everybody who knows anything knows that that's the case.
I would wonder, though, why we don't get any mainstream media coverage of the critique of this. I mean, I actually found it quite unnerving that, the presence of a soldier at the scene of the bomb attack is not even mentioned, not even talked about, not even questioned. And actually, a lot of the journalists are immediately talking about bomb factories as if they're factual. Actually, they're not. They're alleged by the police to be a bomb factory until they've actually been proved. So there seems to be almost immediately jumping on the bandwagon with to what the authorities are saying. I think actually the corporate media plays a big role in all this, doesn't it? Because it's actually part of the rollback of the state is big media. They're part of it.
Well, the whole point of doing these things, if you are let's call them a rogue group within the intelligence services, is to achieve certain political effects. Now, from the Turks' point of view, they've been pushing for a Western intervention in Syria to overthrow Assad for ages and ages, but they've been checkmated by the Russian intervention. So they're prime suspects for setting up some kind of atrocity in Europe, right around the corner from NATO headquarters, so that they can then plead for an intervention in Syria to deal with ISIS, which they themselves have created. And as the Russians have shown, Bilal Erdogan, the son of the president, has been massively profiting from trading oil with ISIS.
He's got into trouble over in Italy too, hasn't he?
Well, yes, the Bologna magistrates want to interview him as well. They want to extradite him. And, of course, in Turkey itself, everybody knows that top generals were convicted of doing exactly this in the Ergenecon trials some years ago. They were basically bombing, shooting, killing, pretending to be right-wingers, left-wingers, Islamists, and the whole point of these strategies of tension is to get the population scared of being attacked by Islamists, by fascists, by lefties in the Red Brigades or whatever it is, and then, of course, you bring in the police state, which is the real agenda behind all of this.
What's the point of it all, then?
Well, the point of it all is the oligarchy, which ultimately controls things, uses terrorism as a mechanism of political control. If we had an outright hierarchical oligarchic society, a Nazi Germany, for example, you don't have to bother with all of this. You just say, this is what we're doing, and if you get in the way, we'll bump you off. But, of course, in semi-democracies, you've got to bamboozle people. So in order to force them to give up their rights and freedoms, you have to scare the pants off them with random terrorist attacks.
One of those rights and freedoms is the intelligence sovereignty that was immediately being said. Actually, all of these countries around Europe are now being pressurised to share all their intelligence with each other, saying, well, if you do that, then we will be able to prevent these sorts of attacks in future.
Well, yes, what people have to understand is that there's been a long-running strategy of tension underpinning NATO's actions for 20, 30, 40 years, going right back to the 1940s. And don't forget, as we have sometimes covered on this programme, the Nazis' intelligence structure was integrated into NATO as NATO was set up. So Reinhard Gehlen, who was the head of the Gestapo, becomes the head of the West German intelligence service.
Well, also the foreign SS units were also incorporated into the first meetings of NATO, weren't they?
So, in other words, there's been a long-running... this is a game that they've been playing for a very long time. The 1993 bombings in Paris, on the Paris metro. Investigations there showed that it wasn't in fact carried out by the GIA, or it was carried out by the GIA, who were an extremist Islamist group, but the GIA was itself a counter-gang created by the Algerian army with the help of their French counterparts to discredit Islamism. And this is the kind of way these people think. If you've got, say, a Muslim insurgency that you're trying to deal with, what you do is you pretend to be Muslim insurgents and you go out and behead people, blow things up, to create mayhem, and blame the others who are supposed to have done it. The Cellar Scouts did a similar thing in Rhodesia. They went around pretending to be Zandler, massacring people and so on. And it goes all the way back to the Kenya in the 1950s, and Frank Kitson, Captain Frank Kitson, then Brigadier Frank Kitson's book, Gangs and Counter-Gangs, about how it was still the British Army's counterinsurgency manual. How you fight insurgents is, but you create false insurgents so that they look as if they are the insurgents, and then they go out and do atrocities, and you blame the insurgents for those atrocities. It's a standard tactic. They've been doing it for years. The Italian police have investigated this fairly thoroughly because they've got independent magistrates in Italy, and they did look into all of this fairly. I mean, Imposimato, the head of the Supreme Court, has written a book about it all, which came out in 2012, pointing out that virtually all terrorism in Italy in the 70s and 80s was carried out by the intelligence services. I would suggest that that's still likely to be the case today.
How long until we get some sort of nuclear terrorist attack?
Well,
after the Brussels attacks, the leaders, world leaders, are looking at the threat of nuclear terrorism, we hear. Still reeling from the attacks in Brussels and Paris, world leaders wrestling this week with the chilling prospect of the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, ISIS, or other extremists unleashing a nuclear attack on a major Western city.
Well, if your goal ultimately is to invade Syria so that you can get a government that you want, which will build a pipeline that you want to stop the Russians controlling the European gas market, you have to keep going until you get the result you want. And if the bombing in Brussels isn't enough to get NATO into Syria, then maybe something more extreme will have to be done in order to achieve the goal that you're going for. The problem with all of this is that the people behind it, and I think it's people in the Western intelligence services like MI2 who are behind all of this, and our own MI6, is they're so deeply in now, they're so deeply involved in this kind of bloody carnage that they can't back down. And therefore, of course, the possibility of a nuclear false flag attack is definitely there, because they have put it on the agenda.
And why is it that the last big terrorist attacks in Belgium, which were found to be carried out by NATO, haven't even had a single mention anywhere in the mainstream press?
Well, that's the problem, isn't it? Because if we don't know, those who do not learn the lessons of history are doomed to repeat the mistakes of the past. And understanding NATO's role in creating terrorism, in Turkey in particular, and in Belgium, is absolutely essential if you want to understand what may have happened in Brussels the other week.
You can listen again to any shows at bcfmradio.com and leave comments about your favourite programmes. BCFM 93.2, your interactive station, 24 hours a day.
Now we move on to have a look at the Thursday, 23rd of June, and the EU referendum. But in the context of fraud at last year's general election, which we've been looking into in this show over the last 6 or 8 months. We heard from Simon Hines about swings in all the marginal constituencies. So it seems there are very many other problems too with it, but it seems that no holds are barred when it comes to referenda and elections, and when we cast our vote it may be that someone is fixing the result, a bit like the lottery perhaps. Anyway, to discuss the prospects for a free and fair EU referendum, I'm joined now by our Witney correspondent, I hope you don't mind me calling you that, Dave Barmby. Hi, Dave. Welcome to the Politics
Whatever you want to call me, yeah.
Well, really? Anyway, first of all, tell us a little bit about yourself, Dave, because I know that you were involved a bit with the actual selection of David Cameron as your local MP.
Yeah, just before we come to that, I'd like to just butt in on your last discussion.
Oh, about Brussels, yeah.
Just heard the tail end of what you said. You obviously have a very learned and sophisticated view about these bombings which seem to go on and on. Myself, I have a somewhat naive view because I think, like many people in society, we switch off and we just don't want to hear it anymore. It seems to me that there's a cycle of violence where we bomb them. When I say we, I mean the French, the Americans, the British, and perhaps the Italians and others bomb them, and they bomb us in retaliation. So it's a cycle of violence. But there may be false flags in there as well. You've got more knowledge about it than I have. The only other thing I would say, I did take an interest in 9/11, if I might just briefly say that. I've been connected with the architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth. Have you heard of those? And they produced this very good booklet, Beyond Misinformation, and they've conclusively proved, I think, that Building 7 was a demolition job. So if it was a demolition job, then who demolished it and why?
But Dave, you're an electrical engineer, not a structural engineer.
No, I think engineers start off their engineering career with general engineering, and they talk to. I mean, I've worked on multidisciplinary projects which involve mostly satellite earth stations and microwave links, and you get involved in a lot of the structural things. And you have to understand bending moments and that type of stuff. I'm not no expert, but looking at the evidence, I think it's conclusively proven by these architects and engineers that 9/11. The Building 7 was a demolition job. So if that was a demolition job, and it was the first building ever, and we're going off topic, I suppose, it's the first building ever that was demolished by so-called fires. And of course that leads on to the Twin Towers.
What happened to them? Yeah. Well, anyway, what I'll do is I'll put a link to that, the PDF of that document on architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth on our show page at thisweek.org.uk. But anyway, let's get back to you and about David Cameron, because you have had some contact with him and you helped him get the nomination to stand in.
Well, I've been reluctant over the years to talk about somebody I was quite closely involved with back in 2000 and 2001, helping him to become the PPC for Whitney, because you feel you're telling tales about somebody. But since David Cameron has moved so far away from the position he had in 2000, for instance, he